On October 17, 2006, a man stepped off a rooftop in the French Quarter of New Orleans. Police initially thought it was just another suicide, until they checked his pocket. Inside was a folded note. Written in careful handwriting, it read, "This was not an accident. I had to pay for the life I took. Send police to 826 North Rampart Street." Officers didn't know it yet, but that address would lead them to one of the most disturbing apartment scenes New Orleans had ever seen. But this story does not begin with a crime. It begins with a city already broken. A war veteran sent home without help. A woman carrying violence and addiction inside her long before the storm. And a disaster that didn't just flood streets, it stripped away structure, support, and accountability. What happened inside that apartment wasn't sudden. It was slow, preventable. And it's still happening across America today. Before the storm ever formed over warm Gulf waters, New Orleans was already living on borrowed time. To outsiders, the city looked eternal. Music spilled out of open doors. Neon signs buzzed late into the night. People danced even when they had no reason to celebrate. New Orleans had always carried its grief with rhythm, its pain with flavor, its trauma with jokes told over drinks. But underneath that surface was a city strained thin, by poverty, by neglect, by systems that had learned to tolerate dysfunction instead of fixing it. Long before Hurricane Katrina, New Orleans ranked among the highest U.S. cities for unemployment, domestic violence, and untreated mental illness. Entire neighborhoods lived one missed paycheck away from collapse. Public health infrastructure was underfunded. Addiction treatment was scarce. Mental health care, especially for low-income residents and veterans, was often inaccessible or non-existent. People survived here by adapting, by improvising, by numbing. And when people live that way long enough, survival starts to look like normal life. The French Quarter sat slightly higher than the rest of the city. It was protected, relatively speaking, less flood-prone, more resilient. That made it a refuge. Artists, bartenders, musicians, drifters, and people trying to outrun their past all found their way there. It was a place where rules bent easily. Bars stayed open late. Jobs paid in cash. Relationships formed fast and burned hot. Addiction could hide behind nightlife. Trauma could disappear behind a smile and another drink. It was into this environment that two deeply fractured people would collide. But first, there was the city itself, holding everyone together loosely like a structure already cracking at the seams. In the years leading up to Katrina, New Orleans had endured multiple evacuation scares, near misses, and warnings. Experts had been sounding alarms about the levee system for decades. Reports existed. Simulations were run. Funds were requested. Most were ignored. The understanding was quiet but shared. If the levees failed, the city would drown. Still, life went on. People trusted that someone, somewhere, had it handled. They were wrong. For many residents, especially those living paycheck to paycheck, evacuation wasn't simple. Leaving required money, transportation, time, and somewhere to go. Tens of thousands had none of those. So when hurricane warnings came, people learned to weigh risk against reality. Could you afford to leave? Could you afford to stay? Would anyone help you if you didn't? Those questions lingered unanswered long before Katrina ever made landfall. At the same time, another crisis was unfolding quietly, one that didn't make headlines. Veterans were coming home from overseas conflicts in increasing numbers. Many returned with psychological injuries they didn't yet have words for. PTSD screenings were inconsistent. Follow-up care depended on paperwork, classifications, and discharge status. If you were honorably discharged, you might receive support. If you weren't, you often received nothing. No counseling. No long-term care. No safety net. Trauma didn't disappear because benefits were denied. It just had nowhere to go. New Orleans absorbed these men and women easily. The city didn't ask questions. It gave them jobs that didn't require resumes. Nights that blurred into mornings. Alcohol that dulled memory. Drugs that offered temporary silence. And for a while that worked. Until it didn't. The French Quarter became a crossroads for people running from something. Failed marriages, broken homes, war memories, addiction, grief. It was a place where identities could be reshaped nightly. Bartender. Artist. Free spirit. Survivor. But trauma doesn't care how beautiful the mask is. It waits. By the summer of 2005, the city was tense in ways people couldn't quite articulate. The heat pressed heavier than usual. Money felt tighter. Tempers were shorter. Substance use climbed quietly. Emergency services were stretched thin. Mental health resources were overwhelmed. Domestic disputes were routine. And still New Orleans danced. because that's what it had always done. When meteorologists began tracking a tropical system that would become Hurricane Katrina, early reports sounded familiar. Another storm. Another scare. Another disruption. Few imagined what was coming. Fewer still imagined what would happen after. Because disasters don't just destroy buildings. They remove structure. They erase routine. They strip away the thin layers of stability holding people together. And for those already barely standing, that loss can be fatal. This story doesn't begin with violence. It begins with neglect. A city stretched thin. A system unprepared. People surviving without support. When the storm arrived, it didn't create chaos. It exposed it. And when the water receded, what remained wasn't recovery. It was reckoning. In the next chapter, we meet a young man who came to New Orleans searching for freedom, and unknowingly carried war home with him. Before the uniforms, before the deployments, before the nightmares that would follow him home, Zack Bowen was just another restless teenager looking for somewhere to belong. He arrived in New Orleans in the mid-1990s with his father, a 17-year-old still deciding who he wanted to be. The city took him in easily. It always did. New Orleans had a way of welcoming people without asking many questions, especially those who didn't have clear answers themselves. Zack was tall, unusually tall even then, with an easy smile and a presence that filled a room without effort. People described him as charming, funny, a little goofy. The kind of guy who could talk his way into a job or out of trouble. The kind who didn't seem dangerous. And at that point he wasn't. His parents had separated when he was young. Stability came in pieces, not as a whole. He moved between households, between expectations, between versions of himself. By the time he reached New Orleans, he was already used to adapting, blending into whatever environment would have him. He enrolled in a local high school but didn't stay long enough to graduate. Instead, he found something else that suited him better: work. Bourbon Street didn't care about diplomas. Bars needed hands. Late shifts needed bodies. And Zack, barely 18, fit in perfectly. He worked nights, learned how to read people quickly, how to keep conversations light, how to make strangers feel seen for just long enough to tip well. It was a life built on movement and distraction. Long nights. Short mornings. No real plan beyond the next shift. For a while that was enough. It was during this time that Zack entered his first serious relationship. It moved fast, as things often do in places where everyone is running from something. There was excitement, intensity, the illusion of adulthood. Then came responsibility. A pregnancy. A child. Then another. Fatherhood changed Zack, or at least it forced him to confront the parts of life he'd been avoiding. Friends noticed a shift. He worked more. Talked about the future. Tried to take things seriously. But responsibility didn't come with a roadmap. He wanted to be better but didn't know how. When legal trouble brushed past him, minor but frightening, it shook him deeply. For the first time, the idea that his life could spin out of control felt real. So he asked for advice. And someone pointed him toward the military. Structure. Discipline. A purpose bigger than yourself. For someone searching for direction, it sounded like an answer. Zack earned his GED. He signed the paperwork. He committed to an 8-year contract that promised stability and honor. He left New Orleans believing he was becoming someone new. The military gave him what it promised. At first, training was grueling but grounding. There were rules, routines, expectations. For someone who had spent years drifting, it felt like being anchored. Then came deployment. And with it, a version of reality Zack had no preparation for. He was sent overseas on peacekeeping missions that required more than physical endurance. He was assigned to recover bodies from mass graves. To handle remains. To catalog death carefully, respectfully, day after day. It wasn't combat in the way movies portray it. It was worse. It was intimate. Methodical. Unavoidable. There were no hero moments. No clear enemies. Just evidence of what humans could do to each other. And then there were the children. One small interaction, a piece of candy offered, a smile exchanged, ended in execution the next day. A child punished for speaking to an American soldier. Zack carried that with him. It became a dividing line in his life, before and after. As deployments continued, the cracks began to form. He grew quieter. More withdrawn. Less present. The army noticed physical injuries but missed the psychological ones. Pain in his feet was addressed with surgeries. Pain in his mind was ignored. When he came home between deployments, he wasn't the same man his family remembered. But there was no language for that yet. No diagnosis. No treatment. No pause. After Iraq, something inside him hardened. He saw fellow soldiers injured and killed. Civilians caught in the crossfire. Moral lines blur beyond recognition. Reports of prisoner abuse shook whatever faith he had left in the mission. The structure that once grounded him began to feel suffocating. He grew resentful, angry, lost. So he did what many traumatized soldiers do when they don't know how to ask for help. He self-destructed, failing physical tests, ignoring rules, sabotaging his own standing. Eventually the system responded, not with care but with removal. Zack was discharged. Not honorably. And with that classification came consequences he didn't fully understand at the time. No veteran benefits. No guaranteed mental health care. No long-term support. Years of service, trauma, and sacrifice ended with a signature and a door quietly closing behind him. He returned to New Orleans carrying everything he had seen, and nowhere to put it. The city welcomed him back without question. Bars were hiring. Drinks were cheap. The past could be drowned nightly. From the outside he looked like he'd simply come home. Inside the war had followed him. In the next chapter, we meet the woman whose own storms would collide with his, long before either of them realized what they were walking into. Addie Hall did not come to New Orleans to be saved. She came because the city spoke her language. She was creative, restless, expressive to her core. The kind of person who danced through rooms barefoot, who wrote poetry on scraps of paper, who believed life was meant to be felt intensely, even when it hurt. Born in North Carolina, Addie left home young. School never held her attention for long. Structure felt like a cage. What she wanted was movement, experience, freedom without permission. She found that freedom in dance. Teaching, performing, traveling, Addie built an identity around expression, around motion, around the idea that she could outrun pain if she stayed moving long enough. But pain has a way of keeping pace. When Addie first visited New Orleans in the early 2000s, she didn't hesitate. Mardi Gras energy, music pouring from the streets, art everywhere you looked. It felt like a place where intensity wasn't just accepted, it was celebrated. So she stayed. Friends described her as magnetic, funny, charismatic, someone who could pull people in effortlessly. She had a laugh that filled rooms, a confidence that made others feel alive just by standing near her. But there was another side. One that only appeared when alcohol or drugs entered the picture. That version of Addie was volatile, angry, sharp-edged. Words became weapons. Friends recalled nights where she flipped suddenly, lashing out with cruelty that felt disconnected from the woman they knew during the day. Some saw it as trauma surfacing. Others saw it as addiction taking control. Many didn't know what to call it at all. They just knew it was dangerous. Addie had survived abusive relationships before. At least one left her physically injured, bruises, broken bones, lasting fear. Those experiences shaped how she moved through the world afterward. She trusted slowly. She defended herself aggressively. She carried a gun, not always loaded but always close. To some, it looked like empowerment. To others, it felt like a warning sign. She lived in a state of hypervigilance, always ready for a threat, real or imagined. Her anger wasn't random, it was protective. But protection built on fear often becomes violence of its own. Addiction blurred everything further. What began as casual partying turned into dependence. Cocaine, alcohol, used to stay awake, to feel alive, to silence the past. The same substances that numbed pain also amplified rage. Friends watched her cycle through highs and crashes, relationships that burned hot and ended badly. They worried, but New Orleans didn't have many places to send worry. Treatment was expensive. Mental health care was limited. Intervention felt intrusive. So people adapted. They learned what version of Addie they might get that night. They braced themselves. They stayed or they left. When Addie met Zack, she didn't see a monster. She saw someone broken in familiar ways. He was funny, charming, gentle at first. He listened. He understood pain without needing it explained. He carried his trauma quietly, which made it feel safer. At first she didn't even like him much. Thought he was corny. Too eager. Too soft. But proximity does things. They worked opposite shifts at the same bar, passing each other in that in-between space where exhaustion lowers defenses. Shots after work. Conversations that slipped from casual to confessional. They bonded over chaos. Over being misunderstood. Over feeling abandoned by systems that were supposed to protect them. Over the belief that love could fix what therapy never touched. Zack never told her everything. Not about the kids. Not about the marriage that technically still existed. Not about how deeply the war had changed him. And Addie in her own way hid too. Her volatility. Her history. The darkness that came out when substances took control. What they shared wasn't stability. It was recognition. Two people seeing their own damage reflected back at them, and mistaking that familiarity for safety. Their relationship ignited quickly. Passion without boundaries. Intensity without breaks. Friends noticed the red flags early. Jealousy, possessiveness, explosive arguments followed by dramatic reconciliations. But when they weren't fighting, they were inseparable. Laughing. Partying. Holding on to each other like anchors in a city that never stopped shaking. They didn't slow down. They didn't seek help. And then the storm came. In the next chapter, everything around them collapses, and for a brief, dangerous moment, the chaos feels like freedom. In late August of 2005, the air in New Orleans felt different. Heavier. So, as if the city itself was holding its breath. Weather reports had begun tracking a storm forming in the Gulf. At first, it sounded familiar. Another hurricane, another warning that might turn into nothing. New Orleans had lived through decades of close calls. People were used to weighing forecasts against reality, panic against practicality. But this time the tone shifted fast. Katrina strengthened with terrifying speed. What had been projected as manageable grew into something historic. By the time evacuation orders were issued, many residents were already trapped by circumstance. No car, no money, nowhere to go. For some, staying wasn't defiance. It was inevitability. Zack and Addie chose to stay. The French Quarter sat on slightly higher ground. Locals believed it would be safer. And for Zack, the idea of leaving, of packing up, of chaos on the roads, of authority and orders, felt unbearable. Being surrounded by emergency systems again triggered something deep and old. Addie didn't argue much. Part of her felt invincible. Another part welcomed the suspension of normal rules. No work. No expectations. No consequences, at least for a while. So they waited it out together in her apartment. Candles replaced electricity. Alcohol replaced sleep. Music echoed through rooms that shook under the wind. Outside, the city was being dismantled. Inside, they clung to each other. When Katrina hit on August 29th, it did not arrive gently. The levees failed. Water rushed in faster than anyone had imagined. Entire neighborhoods disappeared beneath floodwaters. Families were separated. People climbed onto rooftops, waved sheets, screamed for help that sometimes never came. 80% of the city flooded. Nearly 2,000 people would die. What followed was not rescue, but silence. Power went out. Cell service failed. Emergency response collapsed under the scale of the disaster. New Orleans became a city without clocks, without schedules, without systems. And for a brief, surreal moment, it felt like time had stopped. The French Quarter escaped the worst of the flooding, but it did not escape the aftermath. Streets were littered with debris. The air smelled of rot and gasoline. Sirens faded. Police presence thinned. Rules became suggestions. People emerged from buildings stunned, dazed, unsure of what came next. Neighbors banded together out of necessity. Cookouts formed in the streets. Mattresses were dragged outside. Music played from battery-powered radios. Strangers shared food, alcohol, stories. It was survival, but it also felt like rebellion. For Zack and Addie, this was intoxicating. No bosses. No bills. No reminders of the lives they had been failing to manage. Just the present moment. They helped clear debris. They shared drinks with neighbors. They laughed in ways that hadn't felt possible before. Journalists passing through captured images of people dancing amid destruction. Proof that New Orleans refused to disappear quietly. Zack and Addie were photographed together, framed as symbols of resilience. But resilience built on denial doesn't last. As days turned into weeks, the initial shock faded. And reality crept back in. Rescue teams arrived. Military personnel moved through the streets. Authority returned in pieces. Curfews. Rules. Order. For Zack, the sight of soldiers was unbearable. Uniforms. Commands. Weapons. They pulled him back into memories he had spent years trying to outrun. His PTSD resurfaced, not as sadness but as agitation, anger, and paranoia. Addie felt the shift too. The freedom she had tasted began slipping away. Jobs would return. Responsibilities would follow. The chaotic bubble they lived in was shrinking. And neither of them wanted to face what waited on the other side. When the city began to rebuild, Zack and Addie resented it. They hated the idea of clocks and schedules returning. They mocked people trying to reclaim normal. They clung to the post-storm lifestyle, partying harder, sleeping less, using more. What had started as coping became dependence. Drugs filled the gaps. Alcohol smoothed the edges. Arguments grew louder, more frequent. The same intensity that once bonded them now turned inward. Data services slowly came back online. Zack's past caught up to him. His children. His obligations. The reality he had postponed. Addie didn't want reminders of a life that wasn't centered on her and the chaos she could control. The presence of children felt like an intrusion. A threat. Jealousy surfaced. Resentment hardened. Control became currency. The storm had stripped away structure. What replaced it was not healing, but escalation. In the next chapter, the world resumes, but the damage has already been done. Normal did not come back all at once. It crept in quietly. Electricity flickered on in pockets of the city. Businesses reopened with skeleton crews. Sirens returned. Paychecks became necessary again. The illusion that Katrina had erased responsibility dissolved day by day. For many people, rebuilding meant relief. For Zack and Addie, it felt like suffocation. Zack went back to work first. He took whatever job he could find, long hours, low pay, no questions asked. On the surface it looked like progress. A man trying to stand back up. But inside he was unraveling. The structure he needed came without support. No counseling. No trauma screening. No acknowledgement of what he carried back from war, or what Katrina had stirred back up. Stress piled on stress. His children were back in New Orleans now, living with their mother. The guilt hit him in waves. He agreed to child support. Visitation. Responsibilities he had postponed suddenly demanded attention. And every obligation felt like judgment. Addie reacted differently. She returned to bartending, slipping easily back into nightlife. Attention came naturally. So did temptation. Alcohol flowed. Drugs followed. Late nights turned into early mornings with no sleep in between. She resented anything that threatened her sense of control. Zack's kids represented everything she feared. Permanence, accountability, a future that didn't revolve around her. When the children visited, Addie withdrew. She avoided them. Left the apartment. Locked herself away. Eventually she made it clear, this was her space. The kids were not welcome. Zack complied. Not because he agreed, but because he didn't know how to fight without losing everything. Their arguments intensified. Money. Jealousy. Substance use. Zack's past. Addie's anger. Every disagreement escalated quickly. Voices raised. Objects thrown. Apologies followed by promises neither of them could keep. Friends noticed bruises. Neighbors heard shouting. Police were called more than once. Each time the cycle reset. No charges. No intervention. No follow-up. Just two people allowed to spiral unchecked. Addie's behavior grew more volatile. There were incidents, public confrontations, threats, moments where her rage crossed lines even her friends couldn't excuse. At one point, she was arrested after brandishing a firearm during an argument. Zack didn't bail her out immediately. That silence cut deep. But when she was released, they reunited anyway. They always did. Because separation felt worse than abuse. Zack's behavior deteriorated too. He became possessive, suspicious, emotionally erratic. He showed up at Addie's workplace uninvited. Started fights over imagined slights. Picked battles with strangers. At one point he was arrested himself, drug-related, minor but humiliating. He spent days in jail. Addie bailed him out. The roles reversed. The dependence deepened. They were no longer partners. They were trapped. Substance use escalated. What once felt recreational now felt necessary. Hundreds of dollars a week disappeared into cocaine and alcohol. Sleep became optional. Judgment disappeared entirely. Reality blurred. Every fight felt final. Every reunion felt desperate. They broke up and got back together so often that even they lost count. Each time, the reconciliation came with more intensity, more promises, more denial. Zack began questioning his identity in ways that frightened Addie. He explored parts of himself he had long suppressed. When Addie discovered this, her reaction was explosive. Rage poured out in cruelty, homophobic slurs, humiliation, deliberate attempts to destroy him emotionally. She took his phone. Called people in his contacts. Spread lies designed to isolate him completely. It was calculated. It was vicious. It was meant to leave him alone. And it worked. At this point, there was no longer any illusion of a healthy relationship. Friends begged them to separate. Neighbors avoided them. The apartment became a pressure cooker, sealed tight, heat rising, no release valve. Something had to give. Instead of leaving, they doubled down. They decided to move. In the next chapter, they find the apartment on North Rampart Street, a space that would become the final stage for everything they refused to face. The apartment sat above a voodoo spiritual temple on North Rampart Street. Small, dim, old. To anyone else it might have felt ominous. But to Addie it felt like control. A clean break. A fresh start on her terms. To Zack it felt like hope. They toured it together. The landlord handed over the keys after a cash deposit and a verbal agreement. No paperwork yet. No boundaries yet. Just possibility. 2 days later Addie went back alone. She asked for a written lease, with only her name on it. The landlord complied. By the time Zack came home from work that night, the trap was already set. She told him casually, "Your name isn't on the lease." The words landed harder than a punch. Zack understood immediately what it meant. He had paid. He had helped secure the place. And now he had no legal claim to it, or to her. They argued. Then they exploded. Addie began throwing his belongings toward the door. Clothes. Personal items scattered across the floor like discarded pieces of his life. Her words cut deeper than anything physical. Failures. Insults. Homophobic slurs. Reminders of everything he hated about himself. She told him he was nothing. That he was replaceable. That he didn't belong there. Zack tried to leave. But she wouldn't stop talking. Something snapped. It wasn't sudden rage, it was collapse. Years of trauma. Years of silence. Years of being pushed, dismissed, humiliated. He wanted the noise to stop. Zack wrapped his hands around Addie's neck. And kept them there. When it was over, the apartment went quiet in a way it never had before. The aftermath wasn't panic. It was dissociation. Zack didn't run. He didn't call for help. He sat there, numb, detached, as if watching someone else's life play out. He picked up Addie's journal. And began to write. He described what he had done with horrifying calm. Not as a confession, but as documentation. As if recording the moment might make it unreal. Then came actions even harder to comprehend. Acts that crossed lines so final they erased any remaining humanity from the room. The apartment became something else entirely. A sealed crime scene. A monument to everything left untreated. In the days that followed, Zack moved through the city like a ghost. He went to work. He went to bars. He told people Addie had left town. No one questioned him. Why would they? Addie had vanished before. She was known for leaving suddenly. The city was still fractured. Disappearances weren't unusual anymore. But inside the apartment time stood still. Air conditioning blasted constantly, to slow what could not be stopped. The walls filled with messages. The journal filled with entries. And Zack spiraled deeper. Over 9 days he spent everything he had. Drugs. Alcohol. Strangers. No sleep. He burned himself with cigarettes. Spray-painted walls. Tried to outrun what waited behind a locked door. But the end was always approaching. On October 17, 2006, Zack went to a rooftop bar in the French Quarter. He drank. He paced. He wrote a note. Not an apology. Not an explanation. A direction. When police later found his body in the parking garage below, they discovered the folded paper in his pocket. Written clearly. Deliberately. It told them where to go. And what they would find. In the next chapter, detectives step inside the apartment on North Rampart Street and discover a scene that would haunt New Orleans forever. Detective Tom Moravich arrived at the address just after dawn. 826 North Rampart Street. From the outside, it looked unremarkable, another aging French Quarter building layered with history, mystery, and neglect. The kind of place tourists walked past without noticing. The kind of place that hid its secrets well. Police unlocked the door. And immediately knew this was not a routine call. The smell hit first. Stale. Chemical. Wrong. Inside, the apartment was dim, cluttered with moving boxes and empty bottles. Beer cans covered nearly every surface, stacked like careless monuments to excess. The air conditioning blasted cold air, unnatural for the season. Then they saw the walls. Black spray paint covered them, words scrawled in desperation, guilt, and confusion. I loved her. Please help me stop the pain. Call my wife. The messages weren't decorative. They weren't symbolic. They were cries written too late. The officers moved slowly, methodically. This was not a burglary. Not a suicide. Not an accident. This was something personal. Something deliberate. As they searched the apartment room by room, the reality of what had happened there began to unfold, not through shock but through accumulation. Through details that refused to make sense together. Evidence of planning. Evidence of panic. Evidence of a mind unraveling in real time. And then, confirmation. The the kind no investigator ever forgets. The scene would later be described as one of the most disturbing many of them had ever encountered, not because of gore but because of intent. Because someone had lived among the consequences of their actions for days. Written about it. Documented it. Zack Bowen had not fled. He had waited. The journal was found not hidden but left behind. Page after page detailed his thoughts, his justifications, his spiraling guilt. He wrote as if the words might explain what his voice never could. There was no attempt to deny what he had done. Only an attempt to control the narrative. To be heard. As police secured the scene, news of the discovery spread quickly. New Orleans had already endured disaster. Already endured loss. Already endured trauma. But this was different. This wasn't a storm. This wasn't fate. This was violence born of neglect, personal, institutional, and societal. The city reacted with disbelief, then horror, then fascination. Headlines exploded across local and national media. Nicknames followed, sensational, grotesque, dehumanizing. The story mutated into something larger than the people involved. Zack became a monster. Addie became a mystery. Their humanity was flattened into spectacle. But beneath the noise was a quieter truth. Two people had been drowning long before Katrina. Long before North Rampart Street. Long before anyone intervened. And no one stopped it. In the next chapter, the media storm takes over, and the question shifts from what happened to something far more uncomfortable. How did everyone miss the warning signs? By noon, the story was no longer contained within police radios or sealed evidence bags. It had escaped. Cameras lined the streets outside 826 North Rampart. Reporters spoke in hushed, urgent tones, as if volume alone could make sense of what had been found inside. Helicopters hovered overhead. Names were leaked. Photos were pulled. Narratives began forming, fast, sloppy, irreversible. The city hadn't even buried its dead from Katrina yet. And now it had a new horror to consume. The headlines didn't ask why. They didn't ask how. They asked how extreme can we make this sound? Zack Bowen became the Katrina cannibal. The French Quarter butcher. A monster born of the storm. It didn't matter that investigators had found no evidence of cannibalism. It didn't matter what the medical examiner would later clarify. The image was too powerful. Too clickable. Once the nickname stuck, the truth no longer mattered. Addie Hall disappeared beneath the noise. Her name was mentioned less and less. When it appeared, it was often followed by words like troubled, volatile, wild. Her history of abuse. Her struggles with addiction. Her complexity. Flattened. Reduced to a footnote in someone else's infamy. In death, she was no longer a person. She was a prop in a story that wasn't hers anymore. Talk shows dissected the case like entertainment. Panel discussions speculated about possession, voodoo, dark spirits tied to the building itself. Paranormal experts were booked before psychiatrists. Ghost tours added a new stop within weeks. People stood outside the apartment laughing, taking photos, pointing. This was no longer a crime scene. It was a spectacle. And yet, behind closed doors, people who had known Zack and Addie watched in silence. Friends who remembered laughter. Co-workers who remembered fights. Bartenders who remembered warning signs. Everyone replayed moments that now felt obvious in hindsight. The arguments. The jealousy. The arrest. The nights where someone should have stepped in. But no one did. Because chaos had become normal in post-Katrina New Orleans. And when everything is broken, nothing looks urgent. Zack's military history resurfaced next. PTSD became a buzzword, used, misused, debated loudly by people who had never lived it. Some blamed the army. Some blamed Katrina. Some blamed addiction. Some blamed Addie. Very few blamed the system that abandoned him after years of service. A general discharge. No benefits. No mental health care. No safety net. A man trained for war returned to a city drowning in trauma, with nothing and no one to catch him. Addie's past abuse surfaced too. Friends spoke quietly about her rage when intoxicated. About fear. About the gun she carried, not loaded but threatening. But even those details became twisted, used not to understand her pain but to justify her death. As if suffering disqualifies someone from being a victim. Online forums exploded. Armchair detectives debated theories. Conspiracy threads grew. Some insisted Zack had been possessed. Others claimed the city itself was cursed. Anything, except the simplest truth. Two broken people collided in a city that had stopped protecting anyone. And while the public argued, families mourned in private. Addie's loved ones struggled to even claim her remains. Paperwork delayed. Calls unanswered. Silence stretching for months. Zack's family, devastated and ashamed, arranged a quiet cremation. No cameras. No speeches. Just grief. His ashes were given to the mother of his children. A final burden passed forward. As the noise grew louder, one question became impossible to ignore. If this case wasn't just about one man and one woman, if it was about trauma, neglect, addiction, and abandonment, then how many more stories were quietly heading toward the same ending? And who would be next? In the next chapter, we step away from the headlines and into the long shadow left behind. When the cameras finally left North Rampart Street, they didn't take the damage with them. They never do. What remained were people, ordinary breathing people, forced to live with the aftermath of a story the world had already consumed and moved on from. Lana was the one who got the call. Not from Zack. Not from Addie. From police. At first she didn't believe them. She couldn't. The words didn't fit into anything she understood about the man she had once married, the father of her children, the boy she met in New Orleans years earlier. Shock is protective like that. It delays reality. Friends begged her not to turn on the television. The story was everywhere. His name. His face. That apartment. By the time the truth settled in, it didn't come with clarity. It came with nausea. She had already spent months rebuilding after Katrina. Already fled with 2 children. Already started over in Texas. Already mourned the version of Zack she thought she had lost to the storm. Now she had to mourn him again, this time as a man the world would never see as human. And her children? They would grow up with his name forever attached to something unspeakable. Addie's family waited. Days turned into weeks. Weeks turned into months. Phone calls went unanswered. Paperwork stalled. Confusion layered over grief. By the time they were finally notified and able to claim her remains, the shock had hardened into something heavier, something closer to rage. Addie had been difficult, complicated, angry, loving, damaged. She was also someone's daughter, someone's friend, and she had been erased by the spectacle. Back in New Orleans, the apartment didn't stay empty. It never does. Tour groups added it to their route. Guides whispered stories half true and half invented. Visitors left offerings in the kitchen: cigarettes, money, notes, alcohol. Some claimed they felt a presence. Others swore they saw shadows. But no one asked whether the building needed to become a shrine to suffering. No one asked who that honored. Mental health professionals quietly raised alarms. They talked about PTSD, about addiction, about post-disaster psychology. They coined terms like Katrina brain, a shorthand for the cognitive and emotional unraveling many residents experienced long after the floodwaters receded. Calls to crisis hotlines had skyrocketed. Hospital admissions rose. Violence increased. But funding didn't. Support didn't. And the people most at risk were still slipping through the cracks. Zack's case became a reference point. A cautionary tale. A headline example. But it didn't change the system fast enough to save anyone else. Because systems move slowly. And trauma doesn't wait. Years later, the Veterans Affairs Department would revise eligibility rules. Some veterans previously denied benefits were allowed to reapply. It was progress. But for Zack it came too late. For Addie it came far too late. What remains is an uncomfortable truth. This wasn't just a crime of passion. It wasn't just addiction. It wasn't just mental illness. It wasn't just Katrina. It was all of it, colliding at once, unchecked, untreated, unseen. A pressure cooker with no release valve. And so the story doesn't end with justice. It ends with questions. Questions about responsibility. About care. About what happens when society decides some people are too complicated to help. Because the scariest part of this case isn't what happened inside that apartment. It's how easy it was for it to happen at all. In the final chapter, we step back and ask the question that lingers long after the headlines fade. What are we actually learning from stories like this? Or are we just watching them repeat? By the time the city stopped talking about Zack Bowen and Addie Hall, nothing had actually been resolved. The outrage faded. The tours continued. The apartment stayed standing. And the systems that failed them remained largely unchanged. In the years that followed, experts tried to frame the case as a lesson. A lesson about PTSD. A lesson about addiction. A lesson about domestic violence. A lesson about post-disaster mental collapse. But the truth was harder to swallow than any single explanation. Because this wasn't one failure. It was many small failures stacked quietly on top of each other, until the weight became unbearable. Zack had shown signs of distress for years. War trauma. Moral injury. Survivor's guilt. A sense of betrayal by the institution that trained him and then discarded him. When he returned home, he didn't return to stability. He returned to chaos. A city broken by Katrina. A relationship fueled by substance abuse. No mental health support. No long-term care. No safety net. And yet, no one stopped him. Not because people didn't notice, but because noticing had become normal. Addie had been signaling pain too. Violence. Paranoia. Outbursts. Fear masquerading as control. She carried a gun not because she wanted power, but because she had once been powerless. Her anger wasn't random. It was learned. It was layered. And it was ignored, until it became convenient to use it against her. When violence finally erupted, the public demanded a villain. So they created one. They stripped the story of nuance, erased the warning signs, and reduced it to something easier to consume. Monster. Cannibal. Possession. Curse. Anything but accountability. The uncomfortable truth is this. If Zack had received consistent mental health care after his discharge, this story might not exist. If Addie had been protected after her earlier abuse, this story might not exist. If addiction had been treated instead of normalized, this story might not exist. If post-Katrina New Orleans had been supported instead of abandoned, this story might not exist. But might not doesn't bring anyone back. True crime often promises answers. Closure. Justice. Resolution. This case offers none of those. Only reflection. Only warning. Only the reminder that tragedy rarely announces itself loudly at first. It whispers repeatedly until no one listens anymore. Because the most dangerous myth is that cases like this are rare. They aren't. They're just usually quieter. Less sensational. Less photographed. Until suddenly they're not. In the final chapter we step away from the crime, and sit with what remains. Not the horror. But the responsibility. After the last headline faded, after the tours moved on to fresher ghosts, after the internet found a new tragedy to dissect, there was silence. Not the peaceful kind. The kind that settles when nothing has been fixed. 826 North Rampart Street still stands. People pass it every day without knowing its address, only its reputation. Some feel uneasy. Some feel nothing at all. Time does that, it dulls even the sharpest horrors. But inside that silence lives a truth the headlines never captured. This story didn't begin with a murder. And it didn't end with a death. It began with neglect. Zack Bowen wasn't born a monster. He was shaped, slowly, by trauma left untreated, by institutions that trained him for violence but abandoned him afterward, by a society that equates suffering with weakness. He didn't fall apart all at once. He unraveled in plain sight. Addie Hall wasn't a villain in her own story. She was a survivor who never found safety, who learned control instead of healing, who carried rage because rage once kept her alive. Her volatility didn't make her disposable. Her pain didn't make her expendable. True crime often asks, how could this happen? But the better question is, why was it allowed to happen? Why were warning signs treated as personality flaws? Why was addiction normalized until it exploded? Why was mental illness acknowledged only after it turned fatal? Why do we wait for blood before we intervene? In the aftermath, some changes came. Veterans' access to mental health services expanded. Crisis hotlines were better funded. Post-disaster trauma became part of public conversation. But progress is slow. And silence moves faster. This case is still cited in textbooks. Still debated in forums. Still whispered about on ghost tours. But the real lesson isn't paranormal. It's painfully human. When trauma is ignored, it doesn't disappear. When pain is dismissed, it doesn't soften. When people fall through cracks wide enough to swallow them, the impact doesn't stay contained. It spreads. Somewhere in the US right now, someone is spiraling quietly. Someone is untreated. Someone is afraid. Someone is being written off as too much. And no one is paying attention. Yet, if this story leaves you unsettled, that's not an accident. It's a warning. Not about monsters. Not about curses. Not about evil hiding in buildings. But about what happens after the storm, after the war, after the trauma, when help never comes. Because the real horror isn't what happened inside that apartment. It's how many people saw the signs and kept walking. You're listening to Coziness Stories. Subscribe now so you don't miss the next story waiting for you.